All right, welcome back to the Future Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Elser. Things are heating up in this month's episode as we talk about thermal comfort and perceptions of heat. Hopefully all this talk of heat will warm up our listeners currently dealing with the polar vortex. Keep warm as best you can. Our guest this month is a colleague of mine in the Urban Resilience to Extreme Sustainability Research Network, and she thinks a lot about heat in her research. So without further ado, our guest this month is Yuliya Dzyuban. Welcome, Yuliya.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm currently a PhD student in sustainability at ASU and a UREx fellow. But before that, I did my master's degree in City College in New York, and I also have, my background is in architecture, so I have 2 degrees in architecture, and I come from Ukraine, from other side of the world, and happy to bring my perspective and to Phoenix.
Well, we're happy to have your perspective here. So with that perspective and what you're doing here in Phoenix, you just tell us what you study for your PhD.
Right. So I'm interested in kind of merging my background in architecture and design and sustainability. So I got interested in exploring how people perceive, how urban design affects people's perceptions. And currently, I'm exploring how urban design affects how people perceive heat, because that seems to be heat is a really big problem in Arizona, and I think we can do better with urban designing spaces for people to feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people from Phoenix or people who visit here might have that realization. Walking around it can be such a pain, like literally a pain in the summer to walk around anywhere, any amount of distance, because there's so few trees and other shade structures to make that walking comfortable, waiting comfortable. I know what part of your focus is at bus stops and waiting for bus stops. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot we can do to improve. So how did you get interested in this topic?
Right. I got interested pretty much from my own experience in my own suffering. So I remember I moved to Arizona in the middle of the summer. I think it was August, maybe beginning of August. And it was a long drive from New York to here. And then I stopped at the parking lot, opened the door of the car, and it was just super hot.
Yeah, right, a convection oven.
Yes, convection oven. And I thought, like, oh my God, what am I doing here? It's so hot and so miserable. And then I realized that I cannot really have the same lifestyle as I'm used to. I'm used to urban places where I can walk everywhere. I can use public transit where I don't really need a car. I can do everything while I'm walking from one place to another. And I couldn't really maintain that lifestyle here because it's pretty much impossible to walk when it's so hot and there's so little infrastructure and places are so far from each other. So first I thought, the first reaction was, I want to get out, but then I thought, okay, maybe I can do research and help to make things better. It just doesn't feel right.
Well, thank you for sticking around. Yeah, so I guess I'm curious, so you said you lived in New York and you're from the Ukraine to begin with, so how much different is that city life in those places compared to Phoenix?
Right, so I lived in 4 different places. So from New York, I moved to Cyprus, which is also hot and kind of similar to Arizona. People also drive a lot. And then I moved to New York, and that was much closer to the lifestyle I'm used to. So I'd say in Ukraine, in the city I live, it's also the infrastructure is very developed. People use public transit, people walk. I've noticed that at every bus stop we have some kind of retail, and I think that's actually a great idea. While you're waiting, especially it would be helpful here. While you wait, you can go and get a cool off a little bit, get a cooler drink, and so.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I've never seen that anywhere in the U.S. Have like retail at a bus stop.
Yeah.
Sometimes I guess in New York you'll see like a little stand that has like magazines and like chips or
in
something nearby.
subways,
But in subway stations.
Yeah, so we have them kind of integrated into the bus stop infrastructure. So, and it's different. There may be like just a small supermarket or like specialized store. I don't know, like where you can get your groceries or something while you're waiting on your way home. I think that's very convenient and
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I've never thought about that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Actually, I gave a presentation to landscape design architects, and I showed them how Ukrainian bus stop looks like and how the infrastructure looks like, and someone have noticed that. Yeah.
Well, great. I mean, so much to learn from. Well, I mean, I guess it's really valuable to have people from different perspectives and backgrounds bring this insight, because I would have literally never known about the way that Ukraine designs their bus stops. So that's
right.
that's really cool, and I wouldn't have thought about it. Great. So yeah, I know. So you think a lot about just people and their comfort levels in dealing with heat, and I know scientists in your field use this adaptive model of thermal comfort to describe people's comfort and how they achieve the comfort level. So can you describe what this adaptive model is?
Sure. So, for example, right now we have more than 100 of different thermal indices, and what most of them incorporate a variety of micrometeorological variables, such as different like air temperature, globe temperature, wind humidity, depending on what kind of index it is, plus some physiological characteristics of the body, metabolic rate, clothing level, and that's how basically we define thermal heat stress or thermal comfort. But there is a growing consensus among scientists that we cannot, because thermal comfort is subjective definition, we cannot assess thermal comfort by only looking at this physical measurements and physiological response of the body. There is much more to it. There is a big psychological component that is currently not included in these models. So there is scientists came up with this adaptive model of thermal comfort that includes those. It's more comprehensive, and it includes those three components, which is a physiological response of the body, but also psychological parameters. For example, what are your expectations of the weather? What was your previous thermal history? Is there a nature around? Do you feel that you can control your environment? Or also another component is behavioral. For example, people adjust their behavior to the weather. They can bring an umbrella, they can bring more water or change their clothing. So this is kind of a more comprehensive model, and we don't really have a lot of methods so far on how to study thermal comfort comprehensively, but I think it's a big part. Some studies say that there is that those physiological components can only estimate about 50% of thermal comfort, and everything else is attributed to those psychological perceptions. So I think it's quite important.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and the psychological aspect is not something that I really would have thought about. So I'm come more from a background of like physical science measuring. I sort of think, oh yeah, we can measure it. That's how we'll define it. But as you say, that's not really a complete way to look at this. And I'm just thinking, just sort of anecdotally in my own life. So I grew up here in Arizona, so kind of used to the heat. But then I moved to Indiana to go to college. It was so cold there, and that my first winter, I remember just like not being able to deal with it at all, having just a ton of layers on, and just I think my expectations for what the temperature would be like were totally like, not measuring up with what was I was actually experiencing. But then by the time I was in my fourth year there, winter was just like a normal thing, and I'd sort of established that, oh, this is what it's going to be like. I could sort of set my expectations for what to expect. And anyway, so I just anecdotally I remember just coping better with the winter, even though winters were fairly similar between my freshman and senior year. And I was fairly similar as well. So just anecdotally, yeah.
Right. I mean, the body also acclimatizes
Sure.
to certain climate, right? So you physically may feel better, but those physiological and psychological components are so interconnected. It's sometimes difficult to attribute response to one or the other, but I think we need to study them comprehensively.
Yeah, so a combination.
Yep.
Very interesting. So, as sort of alluded to earlier, one of your major areas of interest is public transportation and people waiting for buses. So could you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with regard to bus stops here in Phoenix?
Sure. I guess it also comes from my personal preferences and interests. I'm a big fan of public transit. I wish I could use it more often here in Phoenix, as I do. Well, I actually use light rail quite often. Since people in Phoenix who use public transit, they also usually mostly socially and economically vulnerable, and they may not have AC in their house, or their AC may not function properly, or they may not be able to afford to pay their electricity bill. So this use of public transit adds more heat stress to their daily heat accumulation on top of what they experience. So when they walk to the bus stop and wait at the bus stop, this may be like another 20 minutes on average one way to be out in the heat. And I think that can be very significant when it's more than 100 degrees out. That's why we decided to go and study the experiences of people currently, and in order to understand how big is the problem and also how it can be improved. So for the past 2 summers, I have a team of students, and we go together and we take measurements in the stops. We've selected pool of stops that have different design characteristics, and I'm trying to see whether people's perceptions change depending on their design of the stop.
Yeah.
So we go to measure and survey people at a standard stop, but then there are some nicer ones that have incorporated art and trees, and we're trying to see whether that helps or not.
So could you describe, so I guess for people who aren't here in Phoenix, what like a standard bus stop would look like?
Right. A standard bus stop is just a metal casing. It's like porous metal bus stop, and usually it's in the middle of nowhere. There is no retail or trees. It's like pretty much in the middle of the street, and there is nothing around. And
is there usually a bench at the stand?
There is usually a bench, yes, but that bench can get up to 130 degrees hot.
Oh my gosh. You probably don't want to sit on that for very long.
They probably don't want to sit, or I guess you can't even sit on it.
Yeah.
Because you'll burn.
You'll burn, yeah.
Yeah. So that's another important aspect, like we have this standard infrastructure, but does it really perform well for Phoenix summers? Does it, or maybe it just functions for half of the year when it's not that hot, And then there are a few improved stops that have different materials. They painted, I think they painted with colors that are a little bit cooler, and they have a lot of vegetation and landscaping. So, and also some different forms of landscaping, some grass and shrubs. So we are trying to see whether that changes how people perceive heat. We ask them questions about how they feel thermally, from like cold to hot, but also ask them whether they think that the environment is pleasant, or whether they think this stop is beautiful or ugly, trying to get into those more subjective perceptions.
Yeah. So I know you asked some questions about whether certain elements at the bus stop whether they thought certain elements were good at providing cooling. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So one of the questions also, we have a number of green and gray infrastructure elements, and then we ask them, which one do you think is beneficial for cooling? Like, which one makes you feel cooler? And naturally, people select bus stop shelters and trees. But for example, big percentage also select water fountains.
Yeah.
We don't have water fountains at bus stops, right? But that shows that this is an important component and something for planning agencies to consider. It doesn't mean that they need to bring water fountains, but there could be other creative ways and to provide water, or at least to understand that that's an important.
Yeah, I was also surprised that something like, I think, I don't remember the exact number, I think around 20% or so of the people you surveyed cited like a bench as being, as providing cooling.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. For example, I've looked at other studies that explore perceived waiting time.
Yeah.
And they found that basic amenities at the stop help to reduce this perceived waiting time, because it's usually public transit is usually negatively associated with waiting time, right? So in this context, I'm interested what kind of infrastructure, is it basic infrastructure or more advanced infrastructure, does it have the same effect on how people perceive heat?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting about the bench, because like, again, so sort of from this background that I have, it's like, oh, well, bench isn't like physically cooling the area, so why would they associate it? But it allows them to sit down, take their mind off of the heat, perhaps. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting that so many people.
Similarly, also, if for example, when the bus stop has a bench or other elements and a tree and maybe like a patch of grass or something, there is also a notion that having perceived control over the environment also increases your thermal comfort. It doesn't mean that you'll move from the tree to the bench, or like you said, you may be on one place, but the feeling of having the control and being able to select where you are makes you feel cooler.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So did you find there to be a relationship between the people's perception of the stops and the actual their thermal comfort?
Actually, I did. So in my study, we only did this in summer, so pretty much half of the respondents felt hot or very hot.
Yeah, makes sense.
But we did find that when people think that this bus stop is more pleasant or more beautiful, they feel a little bit more thermally comfortable. So it helps to improve their thermal comfort by half a point, which I think it's really great. And it seems like could be one other way to consider on how to improve thermal comfort.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So it's not, really interesting, thinking about how design elements to make things more pleasant.
Yeah, and so my sample is limited by what's currently available, right? So we didn't test for all infrastructure elements or like all possible creative ways. So I think this could be improved.
Yeah, a lot of opportunities to expand on this idea.
Yes. If we could do some pilot projects with different design elements to see how they would impact people's perceptions.
Cool. So do you have plans to do that, or to expand this research in different ways?
Well, right now I'm preparing to go and do a similar research in Hermosillo, Mexico. I'm going there for 2 months in May and June under RULA IRES grant. And Mexico is currently developing its, not Mexico, Hermosillo is currently developing its public transit infrastructure. And they don't really have any data on how people perceive public transit or use it, or how do they cope with heat. So I think this would be very valuable to collect this data and provide information for their authorities.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool. So how are Phoenix and Hermosillo? Well, so I guess how do they compare, Phoenix and Hermosillo?
First of all, they have similar climate.
Yeah.
So both of the cities are in the Sonoran Desert and quite similar. But also the development patterns are similar.
Oh,
Hermosillo kind of followed Phoenix development pattern, and the street infrastructure is similar.
Okay. That's great then, for especially if you're drawing these comparisons that have sort of those elements kind of already controlled for, so you can sort of draw some different conclusions. So, well, that's awesome. That sounds really cool. Look forward to hearing about what you find in Hermosillo and how that compares to Phoenix. So outside of bus stops, I know that you were also heavily involved in the heat walk that happened here in Phoenix a couple of months ago, and listeners might remember that I gave a short spiel about that just before it happened, but I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about the heat walk.
So I was a member of the organization team for the heat walk, which is part of a larger heat mappers project that is under Knowledge Exchange for Resilience in network in ASU. And the goal of the heat walk was to create a baseline for thermal comfort for Edison Eastlake neighborhoods. So Edison Eastlake is the neighborhood that received a choice neighborhood grant to be redeveloped, and currently there are 3 public housing projects in the neighborhood, and they want to improve current conditions, provide more mixed income housing, and also create more thermally comfortable conditions for residents. So we wanted to create a baseline of thermal comfort right now, and this would be like a long-term project, and then we could compare this to in like 5 or 6 years when the project is completed, to how things changed or not. So every participant in the walk had a field guide, and they would walk at the pre-designed route, and there were streets with different conditions on the route. There were main roads or neighborhood streets with different landscaping and design elements, and while walking there would be designed stops on the route, and they would answer certain questions in relation to how their thermal comfort and design elements and what would they like to change. And since I'm also interested in more in-depth perceptions, I added the part of qualitative interviews. So we had a smaller group of participants who would walk with an interviewer, and they would talk about their experiences while they walk. And they also had sensors on them, such as heart rate monitor, UV sensor, GPS sensors. So then we can combine this data with their qualitative perceptions and see how their physical responses and microclimate at that specific time relates to their feelings.
Wow, super cool. How many people participated in this?
We had around about 40 people participating, and then 12 people were interviewed.
Okay. Awesome. That sounds like a really, really cool project. And so that won't happen again until after the sort of renovations in the neighborhood have taken place?
No, I think there was a lot of the project caused a lot of interest, and we're thinking to. So this was a great opportunity to test methodology, but we do want to continue doing this work in Edison Eastlake or potentially other neighborhoods that have similar challenges.
Cool. Yeah. Great idea. Seems really important. Something that some of my listeners might know is that I like to ask scientists who I interview to sum up their research in the form of a haiku. So, Yuliya, would you, in addition to being an architect and a scientist, could you please now put on your poet hat and share with us a haiku about your research?
Sure, I'll do what I can. I count my sweat drops, wondering, how much longer? Look, there is a tree.
Oh, that's great. Oh my gosh. That was awesome. That might be the best haiku I've gotten yet. Oh my gosh.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, that was, I mean, no disrespect to everyone else that's providing me haikus, but that was awesome. Well done, Yuliya.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's all the questions I have for you at the moment. Is there anything else you want to say about your research, or is there somewhere that people can reach you if they have questions about your research?
Sure. Thank you so much for allowing me to having the opportunity to share, and people are welcome to reach me, and they can find my information on the UREx website. My email is there. Please, if you're interested, please follow up.
All right, great. Thank you so much again, Yuliya, for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREx as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREx, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.